when a homeless boy shouted, "Don't eat that," to a wealthy businessman in a crowded café. No one could have predicted what would follow. This powerful story of bravery and truth will leave you speechless. This is a tale of courage. Of doing the right thing even when the odds seem insurmountable. What would you do if you saw something wrong? Would you speak up? Let's dive into this extraordinary story of strength and moral conviction. In the heart of the city, where luxury and ambition collided, there was a café known as La Fontaine. Its marble-topped tables and lush greenery made it a haven for the city's elite. Waiters in crisp uniforms glided between tables, balancing trays of finely crafted dishes and sparkling drinks. The air buzzed with chatter and the soft hum of a nearby fountain. At the center of this opulence sat Edward Langston, a wealthy entrepreneur whose success stories filled the headlines. At 68, Edward exuded quiet authority, his silver hair and bespoke suit reflecting a lifetime of calculated triumphs. Across from him sat his wife, Clarissa, a striking woman whose polished elegance turned heads. Yet, behind her dazzling smile, there was an edge, something carefully hidden. Just beyond the patio's ornate fence stood a boy, Liam. His oversized hoodie and worn sneakers contrasted starkly with the café's refined patrons. His sharp eyes darted between tables, scanning plates and movements. A familiar face on the street. Liam was a survivor, scraping by on wits and resilience. Their worlds couldn't be more different. Yet in a matter of moments, their paths would intersect in a way that would change everything. This isn't just a story about a boy and a billionaire, it's a testament to the strength of doing what's right, even when it's terrifying. Nestled in the heart of the city, La Fontaine wasn't just a café, it was an institution. Its outdoor patio, framed by lush greenery and glimmering fairy lights, offered a picturesque view of the nearby fountain, which babbled softly against the hum of city life. Inside, the café was alive with energy. Waiters in perfectly tailored uniforms moved seamlessly between tables, balancing trays of artisan dishes and frothy cappuccinos. The clink of silverware and the low murmur of polished conversations created an atmosphere of effortless sophistication. The aroma of freshly baked bread and rich coffee lingered in the air, mingling with the faint scent of blooming flowers that adorned every table. Guests reclined in plush chairs, their laughter light and their words tinged with self-assured ease. Diamonds sparkled under the midday sun, and designer handbags sat perched on chairs like prized possessions. But just beyond the fence that separated the café's refined world from the bustling streets, a boy lingered. Liam, with his oversized hoodie hanging loosely from his wiry frame, was an uninvited observer. His dark eyes, sharp with curiosity and hunger, darted between the plates of steaming food and the wallets carelessly left on tables. For him, the café wasn't a place of leisure but a stage for survival. The contrast was stark. Inside the café, privilege and indulgence flourished, while outside, the cold reality of the streets gnawed at Liam's resolve. Yet today, the invisible barrier between those worlds would be shattered. At the center of the café, at the best table money could secure, sat Edward Langston, known as a visionary entrepreneur. Edward had risen from humble beginnings to become one of the city's most powerful men. His ventures spanned industries, and his name was often invoked in boardrooms as a symbol of success. Now in his late 60s, Edward carried the confidence of someone accustomed to bending the world to his will. His silver hair was neatly combed, and the cut of his navy suit spoke of tailored precision. Gold-rimmed glasses rested on his nose, and a platinum watch shimmered on his wrist. Despite the trappings of wealth, There was an air of weariness about him, a subtle hint that even empires come with burdens. Across the table sat Clarissa. His wife. The embodiment of elegance. Her raven-black hair fell in perfect waves, framing a face that seemed crafted for magazine covers. Her red lips formed a smile that appeared warm but held no real depth. A diamond bracelet sparkled on her wrist, catching the light as she scrolled through her phone. Though the couple seemed the picture of refinement, their interaction told a different story. Edward's attention drifted. His focus split between his watch and his phone. Clarissa's fingers played idly with her bracelet, her disinterest barely masked by polite smiles. Their conversation was minimal, their connection thin, a subtle indication that all wasn't as perfect as it seemed. On the other side of the patio fence, Liam watched intently. At 14, he was small for his age. His thin frame accentuated by the oversized hoodie he wore to shield himself from the elements. His sneakers, worn and fraying at the edges, told the story of countless miles walked in search of food, warmth, or simply a safe place to sleep. Liam's stomach growled, but he ignored it. Hunger had become a constant companion, one he had learned to suppress with sheer determination. His sharp eyes scanned the scene before him, plates piled high with food he couldn't afford, glasses of sparkling water glinting in the sun. He had been here before, not in the café but on its edges, watching the lives of those who could afford to spend on a single meal what would sustain him for weeks. Liam didn't resent them, he envied them. Yes. But more than anything, he studied them. Survival on the streets had taught him to read people, the way they moved, the tone of their voices, the little details that revealed their true selves. Today, his focus was on the table at the center of the patio. The man in the suit, clearly someone important, and the woman, poised yet distant. Liam didn't know their names, but he could sense the tension between them. His eyes flicked to the steaming bowl of soup placed before the man, his mouth watering at the sight of fresh bread. But then something strange caught his attention. The woman, moving with practiced elegance, slipped a hand into her designer handbag. A small bottle emerged, its contents clear and glistening. Liam froze, his heart pounding as he watched her tilt the vial, its contents disappearing into the soup. She stirred it casually, her expression unchanged, before leaning in to speak softly to the man. The words didn't reach Liam, but the chill in her movements did. 1,000 questions raced through his mind. But one thing was clear, something was wrong. As the man adjusted his glasses and lifted the spoon toward his lips, Liam felt his body move before his brain could catch up. Standing on the edges of a world that didn't notice him, Liam knew he had no choice. He couldn't stay silent. Not this time. Liam's gaze was fixed on the elegant couple at the center table, his hunger momentarily forgotten. He noticed Clarissa move with the precision of someone used to going unnoticed. Her manicured fingers dipped into her designer handbag, and when they re-emerged, they held a small vial. It was tiny, unassuming, a bottle someone might use for medicine or essential oils. Clarissa's movements were fluid, almost too casual, as she twisted the cap open with practiced ease. Liam watched, transfixed, as a clear liquid trickled into the steaming bowl of soup before her. The liquid disappeared instantly, blending seamlessly into the rich broth. His breath caught. Was this real? Did he truly just witness someone tampering with food? His logical mind screamed that there must be an explanation, but the tightening knot in his stomach told him otherwise. Clarissa stirred the soup, her expression calm. before leaning closer to Edward. Though Liam couldn't hear her words. The icy sharpness of her gaze spoke volumes. Panic welled up inside Liam. He glanced around, hoping someone else had noticed. But the café hummed with life as if nothing had happened. Waiters glided by. Patrons laughed. And the world continued obliviously. He clenched his fists. This wasn't his fight, he was just a kid. A nobody. Why should he risk everything for a man who wouldn't even look twice at him? But then Liam's eyes darted back to Edward. The older man adjusted his glasses and reached for his spoon. Time seemed to slow as the utensil dipped into the soup. Liam's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't explain why. But he knew he couldn't let this happen. The moment stretched endlessly. The tension unbearable. And then, like a sudden clap of thunder, Liam's voice tore through the café. "Don't eat that." The words echoed across the patio, shattering conversations and drawing every eye toward him. Forks clattered onto plates. And the gentle hum of the café was replaced by stunned silence. Edward froze mid-motion. His spoon inches from his lips. His sharp eyes snapping to the source of the interruption. Clarissa's head whipped around. Her polished composure faltering as her face twisted in confusion and fury. "What did you just say?" she demanded. Her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Liam's legs felt like lead as he stepped closer to their table. His heart raced. And his hands trembled. But he stood firm. "Don't eat it," he repeated. His voice cracking but growing louder with resolve. "I saw her put something in your soup." Gasps rippled through the café. Patrons exchanged wide-eyed glances, their attention fixed on the unfolding drama. Edward slowly set his spoon down, his expression a mixture of disbelief and suspicion. "Clarissa," he said, his voice low and controlled. "What is he talking about?" She scoffed, her mask of elegance slipping as a venomous tone seeped into her voice. "This is absurd. He's just some street kid looking for attention. Probably trying to scam us." But Liam didn't back down. His fists clenched at his sides. His voice steady as he looked directly at Edward. "I saw her. She poured something into your soup when you weren't looking." Edward's face tightened, his gaze darting between Liam and Clarissa. The weight of the boy's accusation hung heavily in the air, thickening the tension around the table. Clarissa leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Do you seriously believe him?" she snapped, her voice rising in pitch. "Look at him. He's a nobody. Just trying to cause trouble." But Liam didn't flinch. "You can smell it if you don't believe me," he said, his voice gaining strength. "Or call someone to test it. I'm telling the truth." Edward's hand hovered over the bowl, his fingers trembling. The patrons around them watched in rapt silence, their meals forgotten. Whispers began to ripple through the café. "Did you see her face?" one murmured. "She looks nervous," another whispered. The murmurings only fueled Clarissa's fury. She slammed her hands on the table, the sharp sound echoing across the patio. "Enough of this nonsense," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "Edward, eat your soup. And let's go." But Edward didn't move. His eyes, sharp and calculating, locked onto Clarissa's. "You've been acting strange for weeks," he said, his voice calm but razor sharp. "And now this? What's going on?" "Clarissa?" Her carefully constructed composure began to crack. "You can't seriously think I would," she started. But her words faltered as Edward raised a hand to silence her. Why would he lie? Edward asked, gesturing toward Liam. What does he have to gain? Clarissa's mouth opened and closed, searching for a response. But none came. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, their collective doubt forming a tidal wave against her denials. Meanwhile, Liam stood rooted to the spot, his heart pounding but his resolve unwavering. He had done what he could. Whether Edward believed him or not was out of his hands now. Edward leaned back in his chair, studying Liam intently. What's your name, kid? He asked, his voice steady. Liam, the boy replied, his tone firm despite the fear creeping into his chest. Liam, Edward said, his eyes narrowing slightly. Tell me exactly what you saw. Liam took a deep breath, his voice steady as he recounted the events. She took a small bottle out of her bag, a clear liquid. She poured it into the soup when you weren't looking, then stirred it. I swear I'm telling the truth. Edward's face darkened, the wheels in his mind turning. He glanced at Clarissa, who now looked cornered, her polished demeanor unraveling into something far less controlled. This is ridiculous, she spat, her voice dripping with disdain. You're really going to listen to him over me? He's just a street rat. But Edward didn't respond to her. His gaze shifted back to the soup. And for the first time, hesitation crept into his expression. The once confident man seemed torn, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The café held its collective breath, the scene playing out like a high-stakes drama. All eyes were locked on the trio at the table, the once lively chatter replaced by an electric silence. For Liam, the moment felt like an eternity. But no matter what happened next, he knew one thing: he had done the right thing. The air around the table was heavy with tension as Edward Langston stared at the bowl of soup before him. His fingers trembled as he held the spoon just above the surface, the golden rim of his glasses reflecting the sunlight. For a moment, it seemed as though he might dismiss Liam's words entirely. But the boy's unwavering gaze and the urgency in his voice lingered in his mind. Clarissa shifted in her seat, her movements no longer elegant but jerky and uncoordinated. Edward, she began, her voice tinged with nervous laughter. This is absurd. Don't let this street kid ruin our day. You know how people like him are, always looking for an angle. But Edward didn't respond. His focus was on the soup, then on the boy, and finally on Clarissa. Liam, he said, his tone quiet but firm. You're sure about what you saw? Yes, Liam said without hesitation. His fists were clenched at his sides, his voice steady. She poured something in while you weren't looking. You can call someone to test it if you don't believe me. Clarissa's eyes darted around the café, the growing crowd of patrons whispering, the waitstaff frozen in place. And even the faint sound of sirens in the distance made her realize that control of the situation was slipping from her grasp. Edward, she snapped, her voice losing its composure. This is ridiculous. Are you seriously entertaining this nonsense? Edward leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. You're panicking, Clarissa, he said evenly. Why? Her polished demeanor cracked. I'm not panicking, she exclaimed, her voice rising. This is humiliating. I'm your wife. And you're going to let a nobody accuse me of something so vile? But her tone betrayed her. The words came too quickly, too forcefully. And then, as if cornered by her own unraveling defenses, she slipped. You weren't even supposed to make it this long, she hissed under her breath. The words were barely audible. But they were enough. Edward's face went pale, his eyes widening as the weight of her accidental confession hit him. The crowd around them gasped, their whispers turning into a low rumble of shock and disbelief. Before Edward could fully process what he had heard, the piercing sound of approaching sirens grew louder. 2 uniformed officers entered the café, their authoritative presence cutting through the thick tension. The lead officer, a tall man with a calm but commanding demeanor, approached the table. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, glancing between Edward, Clarissa, and Liam. Edward stood, his towering frame still imposing despite the situation. "Officer," he began, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "This boy claims my wife tampered with my food. He says he saw her pour something into my soup." The officer turned to Liam, his expression unreadable. "Is that true, son?" "Yes," Liam said firmly, meeting the officer's gaze. "She took a small bottle from her bag and poured something into his soup. I saw it with my own eyes." Clarissa shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the stone floor. "This is outrageous," she shouted, her voice trembling with fury and fear. "He's lying. He's just trying to make trouble." The officer raised a hand to calm her, his tone measured but firm. "Ma'am, we're going to have to investigate this. Do you have anything you'd like to say before we proceed?" Clarissa's face flushed deep red, and her eyes darted wildly around the café as if searching for an escape. "This is insane," she muttered. But her voice lacked conviction. The second officer carefully picked up the bowl of soup, sealing it in a plastic evidence bag. "We'll need to test this," he said, his voice quiet but professional. As the officers worked, Clarissa's panic grew. She clutched her handbag tightly, her knuckles white. "Edward, you can't let them do this," she cried, desperation leaking into her voice. Edward didn't respond. He simply stared at her, his face a mask of betrayal and disbelief. "Clarissa," he said finally, his voice low but razor-sharp. "Why would he lie? What could he possibly gain from this?" Clarissa's breath hitched. For a moment, it seemed like she might say something to salvage the situation. But instead, her resolve crumbled. "Fine," she spat, her voice trembling with rage. "You want the truth? I'm tired of living in your shadow, Edward. Tired of being controlled, ignored, dismissed." The café erupted in gasps, and Clarissa's voice rose, her words tumbling out in a mix of anger and desperation. "You were never supposed to make it this far. I couldn't take it anymore. You deserve this." The officers wasted no time. "Ma'am, I'm placing you under arrest for attempted murder," the lead officer said, stepping forward and pulling her arms behind her back. "No!" Clarissa screamed, struggling against his grip. "You don't understand. I deserved more. He took everything from me." As she was led away, her protests echoed through the café, growing fainter with every step. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their expressions ranging from shock to disbelief. Edward slowly sank back into his chair, his hands trembling as he pushed the untouched soup away. He stared at the table for a long moment, his usually sharp and calculating expression replaced by one of profound betrayal. Finally, his gaze lifted to Liam, who stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. Edward's eyes softened, a flicker of gratitude breaking through his stunned demeanor. "You saved my life," he said softly. His voice steady despite the chaos that had just unfolded. The café began to hum with murmurs again as patrons processed what they had just witnessed. But for Edward and Liam, the moment was far from over. This was the beginning of an unexpected bond forged in the unlikeliest of circumstances. As the chaos settled and the murmurs in the café quieted, Edward Langston leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on Liam. The boy stood a few steps away, his shoulders tense and his hands clenched at his sides, as if bracing for something worse. But Edward's expression, though weary and lined with betrayal, softened as he looked at the young stranger who had just changed his life. "Liam," Edward said quietly, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Sit down." Liam hesitated, his dark eyes scanning the room nervously. The stares from the café patrons felt heavy, like they were waiting for him to make a mistake. Slowly, he approached the table and perched on the edge of the chair, his movements guarded. Edward studied him for a long moment, as if trying to piece together the boy's story without asking. Finally, he spoke. "You saved my life today," he said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "I don't know why you did it, but I owe you more than I can ever repay." Liam shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting to the table. I couldn't let it happen," he muttered. "I saw what she did, and I knew it wasn't right." Edward nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Most people would have looked the other way," he said after a pause. "But you didn't. That takes courage." Liam shrugged, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't like seeing people get hurt." For the first time in years, Edward truly saw the world outside of his own. He saw Liam not just as a scrappy kid but as someone who had been shaped by struggles far beyond what a boy his age should endure. "How long have you been out here?" Edward asked gently. "A while," Liam admitted, avoiding his gaze. "It's not that bad. You figure out how to get by." Edward's jaw tightened, his thoughts briefly drifting to his own youth, long before his wealth and power had insulated him from hardship. "No one should have to live like that," he said firmly. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his sleek black phone and stepped away to make a call. Liam watched him nervously, unsure of what was happening. Was this his way of getting rid of him? When Edward returned, his face was calm but resolute. "Help is on the way," he said simply. "I have a friend who runs a shelter. They'll make sure you have a safe place to stay tonight. And if you're willing, I'd like to do more than that." Liam blinked, his wariness giving way to cautious hope. "Why would you do that for me?" he asked, his tone defensive. Edward smiled faintly. "Because what you did today showed me something I haven't seen in a long time: selflessness. You didn't have to speak up, but you did. And if the world had more people like you, it would be a better place." For the first time, Liam felt a warmth he hadn't known in years. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he dared to believe it might hold something better. Around them, the café slowly returned to life. Patrons resumed their conversations, though the energy was subdued, marked by lingering disbelief. Whispers floated through the air. "Did you see how she reacted? It was like something out of a movie. That boy saved his life. I can't believe it. What kind of person poisons their own husband?" Some guests discreetly recorded the scene, already imagining how the story might go viral. Others exchanged wide-eyed glances, their faces reflecting a mix of shock and awe. The waitstaff, who had remained frozen during the confrontation, now moved cautiously between tables, their usual grace tinged with unease. It was clear that this was not just another day at La Fontaine. Though the café patrons would eventually leave and return to their own lives, the events of that day left a mark. It was a reminder that even in the most polished, insulated environments, humanity's raw truths could surface. As Edward and Liam sat quietly at the table, the gravity of the day settled over them. Edward broke the silence, his voice reflective. "Sometimes life gives us a chance to change someone else's story," he said. Looking at Liam. "You changed mine today. And maybe I can help change yours." The lesson wasn't lost on anyone who had witnessed the scene. Courage doesn't always wear a suit. And kindness doesn't always come from those with power. Often, it's the people we overlook who show the greatest strength. Liam's bravery didn't just save a life, it reminded everyone in the cafe and anyone who would later hear the story that standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, can have life-changing impacts. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cafe, Liam glanced at Edward. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar, hope. And that, more than anything, was the beginning of a new chapter. As we wrap up this extraordinary story, let's reflect on its powerful lesson: courage doesn't always come from those in power. And kindness often emerges from the most unexpected places. Liam's bravery reminds us that standing up for what's right, even when it feels impossible, can change lives, and not just for the people we help, but for ourselves as well. If this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who might need a reminder that even the smallest actions can create life-changing impacts. And if you want more inspiring tales of courage, truth, and redemption, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes, it's the overlooked moments and unnoticed heroes that shape the world for the better. Until next time, take care. And stay inspired.